Pennsylvania goes to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the president of the United States.
Defeating Hillary Clinton in a campaign unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime.
Politicians, pundits and pollsters were shocked by Donald Trump's victory in 2016, a political earthquake that led to a polling post-mortem and a Democratic Party searching for answers as the Republicans molded themselves around a new electoral maestro.
It happened because we didn't understand the country we preside over.
And you have people putting children to bed tonight, and they're afraid of breakfast.
But 4 years on, what lessons have been learned? Will the Democrats make the same mistakes? Will the Republican strategy that worked last time work again this time? And what about the voters? Because one completely new factor is the effect of the coronavirus pandemic.
When people can't leave their homes, voting becomes a lot more difficult. Then you add restrictions on voting on top of that, and voter suppression becomes weaponized during a pandemic.
These are some of the key lessons from 2016 and what to focus on in 2020.
There's going to be an incredible, long, deep, rigorous autopsy.
One big lesson from 2016, and one of the main reasons why people were shocked by the result, was the polls. Hillary Clinton was the favorite, and yes, she did win the popular vote. And one major lesson is that the Democrats this time round aren't getting too excited about the national polling picture, because they know the Electoral College makes it trickier for them and favors Donald Trump. As Nate Silver from the polling and political analyst website 538 points out, the narrower Joe Biden's victory on the national level, the less chance he has of winning the Electoral College. One lesson is that whereas in other elections the focus was on states like Florida and Ohio as key deciders, now the battlegrounds are focused on the old blue wall that went to Trump in 2016, as well as Arizona, which is seemingly leaning Democratic. Hillary Clinton famously never campaigned in Wisconsin. Many commentators believe that cost her, and why some are now questioning why Joe Biden has made so few visits to swing states, with Democrats worried about their on-the-ground game compared to the Republicans. Just before the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton's chances of winning those swing states were seen as pretty high. In Wisconsin, for example, most polls before Election Day had Clinton leading by between 2 and 12 points. Trump won narrowly. And in Pennsylvania, it was a similar story, with Clinton favored over Trump, but again he won. So what went wrong? One factor is that the state polls overrepresented those who went to college over those who didn't. And there was a strong correlation between education and who you voted for in 2016. The American Association for Public Opinion Research said that many polls didn't adjust to correct for the overrepresentation of college graduates, and the result was overestimation of support for Clinton. But another thing we learned from 2016 was that undecided voters shifted heavily to Donald Trump. In Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, 13 to 15% of voters made their choice in the last week, and undecideds broke for Trump by nearly 30 points in Wisconsin, by 17 in Pennsylvania, and by 11 points in Michigan. I chatted to Thomas Gift, the director of the Center on US Politics at UCL, about the lay of the land ahead of 2020.
I do think this year there are fewer undecided voters. So a lot of individuals have essentially decided, well, I'm either going for Biden or I'm even going for Trump. So that to some extent might suggest that it's not the swing voters that are ultimately going to tip the election in one direction or the other, but it's going to be about turnout.
So because there are fewer undecided voters this time, is that a bonus for Biden or for Trump?
I think it's probably a bonus for Biden, simply because he has the lead in some of these states right now. So if there's less room for movement, fewer voters who are on the fence, I think that has to, be in favor of the candidate with the lead at this point. But again, a lot of this will come down to turnout.
So in 2016, Hillary Clinton voters did not come out in some areas in the same numbers that they did for Barack Obama. Trump's 2016 message struck a chord with voters in the industrial Midwest, the Rust Belt, that has long been seen as a Democratic stronghold. Of the 700-odd counties that voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012, about a third switched to Donald Trump. Channel 4 News spoke to some of those voters in the summer of 2016 in Youngstown, Ohio.
Donald Trump is saying what we've been wanting to hear for the last 35, 40 years. The trade deals this country makes are ridiculous. We get killed. We're sending our jobs overseas, and we're getting nothing back but empty promises.
But what are they saying this time? Data from the Labor Department found that in 2019, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin all saw a drop in manufacturing jobs. Channel 4 News went to Altoona in Pennsylvania last year. Trump claimed 70% of the vote, and it was places like these, with a large white working class population, that helped him win the state in 2016.
You say, I'm living from paycheck to paycheck, but I'm going to vote again for the guy who's in charge of this country right now.
Yeah, because I feel like he is a better president than recently what we've had, what we've seen.
Do you think that President Trump has kept the promises he made to this town?
I believe he's a con. There are a lot of jobs now, but a lot of jobs working in a warehouse for Amazon.
I spoke to the journalist and commentator Sarah Jaffe, whose book Necessary Trouble looked at the anger over the economic situation in the United States that led to Trump's 2016 victory. So Sarah, you said in 2016 that the political and pundit class underestimated the degree of anger and pain in the US. What did you mean by that?
Everything from the closure of factories in places like Indianapolis and Lordstown, Ohio, and the degree to which nothing had actually been fixed after the 2008 financial crisis. And so a lot of people who had lost their homes, who had lost their jobs, are now living in much worse conditions than they had been. There's sort of the swing voters who actually swing between parties, and then there's the swing voters who swing between voting and not voting. And that, in a country that has persistent low voter turnout like the US, is one that we don't talk about nearly enough.
So that working class vote that went to Trump last time, is it going to go to him again this time?
I always want to think about that swing, which is not just between parties, but to swing to not voting. My worry about the guys that I talked to at Carrier who voted for Trump in 2016 is that they won't vote at all this time.
But if turnout was so crucial last time, think about the one major change this year, the coronavirus pandemic. With many voters not wanting to take the risk of voting in person, mail-in ballots will be key. However, the president has raised completely false doubts about their validity.
I'm very worried about mail-in voting because I think it's subject to tremendous fraud and being rigged. The mail-in ballots they're going to be rigged.
With mail-in balloting set to be huge, some have raised concerns about whether the Postal Service will be able to handle the huge influx of votes. Democrats have accused the head of the USPS, Louis DeJoy, who was appointed by President Trump in May, of implementing changes that are designed to sabotage the election. He had planned to reduce post office hours and remove post boxes. After much criticism, those changes will be suspended until after the election.
Will you pledge here today that the Postal Service will do its best to return all ballots this election on time?
I do, sir.
And remember, states have different rules. Some have sent mail-in ballots to all voters. Others you have to request to vote by mail. And in some states you have to provide a justification for wanting to vote by mail, and some even say coronavirus is not a legitimate reason. But there is a worry about the rejection of mail-in ballots. Research from the ACLU in Florida in 2018 found that younger first-time and racial and ethnic minority voters, as well as overseas and military voters, who voted by mail were twice as likely as older white voters to have their ballot rejected. This all feeds into accusations of voter suppression, and that Republicans are trying to make it more difficult for certain groups to be able to cast a ballot. Republicans argue they are simply trying to prevent voter fraud. In recent years, strict voter ID laws have been introduced. Voters have been purged from the electoral roll, and polling stations have been closed.
Hey, how are you?
spoke with Ari Berman, a journalist at Mother Jones and the author of Give Us the Ballot.
The pandemic is the biggest suppressor. So you start there. You start with the fact that when people can't leave their homes, voting becomes a lot more difficult. Then you add restrictions on voting on top of that, and voter suppression becomes weaponized during a pandemic. So will there be enough polling places? Will there be enough poll workers? Will people get ballots they request? Will those ballots arrive back in time? And we know that voter suppression falls harder on some constituencies more than others. It's more likely to affect voters of color. It's more likely to affect younger people. It's more likely to affect first-time voters. It's more likely to affect poorer voters.
Why is it that something like an ID law is so damaging, when I guess the argument on the other side would be like, well, everyone should have their own ID?
And the fact is most people do, but not everyone does. That's the crucial thing. That yes, 90% of people have the ID to vote, but that still leaves 10% that don't have it. A lot of people don't have birth certificates. They don't know where their birth certificate is. Or let's say elderly black voters were born in the Jim Crow South and they weren't able to go to a hospital because there were no hospitals for black people then. They were born at home, so they never got a birth certificate in the first place. I'm very worried about voter suppression because if you look at what happened in the primaries, over 500,000 mail ballots were rejected, which is a much larger number than 2016. So the risk of voter disenfranchisement and the threat of voter suppression is much larger in 2020 because of the pandemic than it was in 2016. And it's not like I'm worried about one state or another state. I'm worried about a lot of different states.
I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton.
This is painful, and it will be for a long time.
So these are just some of the lessons we learned from 2016. Will the state polls that got it wrong last time make amends? Will Joe Biden learn from Hillary Clinton's mistakes and finally get out to those swing states in person? Has Donald Trump done enough to hold on to the Rust Belt? And what about the unknown, the effect of the coronavirus pandemic? One thing is clear from everyone we've spoken to: turnout will be key. Because just like last time, this could come down to small margins that can decide history.